The wind howling across the Wyoming plains carried the sound of a desperate, rhythmic thud, iron striking rusted nails, echoing like a dying heartbeat against the vast, empty sky. Through the haze of swirling red dust, Amelia Thornton swung the hammer again, her hands cracked and bleeding, trying to force rot-eaten boards to hold together. She was building a wall against an approaching winter that promised only death. High above on the limestone ridge, a solitary figure sat perfectly still astride a massive black gelding. Slater Knox watched the woman fighting a losing battle against the elements, his jaw tight. He had sworn never to interfere with the doomed souls of this valley, but as the fragile wall she'd spent hours erecting suddenly collapsed back into the dirt, something within the hardened rancher finally broke. The sun beat down on the cracked earth of the Sweetwater Valley like an anvil, baking the soil into a hard, unforgiving crust. The year was 1883, and the frontier was a place that did not suffer weakness. Amelia Thornton knew this better than anyone. Wiping a heavy arm across her sweat-drenched brow, she tasted salt and dust. She looked at the pathetic collection of timber scattered at her feet. It was the refuse of her past, charred planks and splintered beams salvaged from the ashes of her family's homestead, which had mysteriously burned to the ground just 3 weeks prior. Her father, Thomas Thornton, had perished in that fire, leaving Amelia with nothing but a worthless deed and a plot of land that the local bank, owned by the ruthless Elias Caldwell, was practically salivating to repossess. Caldwell claimed Thomas had died owing him thousands, a debt Amelia knew was fabricated to steal the only thing she had left. She picked up a jagged piece of wood, the remnants of what used to be her kitchen table, and wedged it against a surviving fence post. She was trying to build a lean-to, a rudimentary shelter to protect her from the sudden, violent thunderstorms that swept the plains and the creeping cold of the impending autumn. But the wood was brittle, snapping under the pressure of the heavy iron nails. With every failed strike of her hammer, her frustration mounted. Battling the overwhelming tide of grief, she refused to let consume her. If she cried, she would stop working. If she stopped working, she would die here. A mile away, perched on the highest crest of the limestone ridge that divided the sprawling, prosperous Cross M Ranch from the barren Thornton plot, Slater Knox watched through a pair of brass spyglasses. Slater was a man carved from the very landscape he commanded, broad-shouldered, quiet, and possessed of a reputation that made men step off the boardwalk when he walked through town. He had built his empire through sheer, uncompromising will. He was a man of logic, not charity. Yet, for the past 4 days, he had found his horse drawn to this ridge. He lowered the spyglasses, the leather creaking under his gloved grip. He could see the exhaustion in the way the woman moved. She was thin, her once blue dress now stained brown and gray with soot and dirt. He watched as she hoisted a heavy, blackened beam, struggling to balance it. Her arms shook violently. "She's going to kill herself out there, boss," muttered Josiah, Slater's oldest ranch hand, who had ridden up quietly beside him. Josiah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Or the wolves will get her when the sun dips. Ain't no shelter she's building. That's a coffin with the lid left off." Slater didn't respond immediately. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the solitary figure below. He remembered Thomas Thornton, a stubborn, foolish man, but an honest one. He also knew Elias Caldwell's reputation. Caldwell had been trying to buy out the small holdings along the river bend for a year, anticipating a spur line from the Union Pacific Railroad. "It's not our land, Josiah," Slater said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And it's not our fight." "Never said it was," Josiah replied, adjusting his worn Stetson. "But a man stands by and watches a woman freeze or starve. He's got to ask himself what kind of man he is when he looks in the shaving mirror." Down in the valley, a sudden gust of wind caught the side of the fragile structure Amelia had just managed to prop up. With a sickening crack, the rotted wood gave way. The entire wall collapsed, burying her meager supplies and knocking her to her knees in the dirt. Through the spyglasses, Slater saw her stay down. Her shoulders began to heave. Slater snapped the spyglasses shut and shoved them into his saddlebag. The muscle in his jaw feathered as he pulled hard on his gelding's reins, turning the beast toward the timber mill on the east side of his property. "Hitch up the flatbed wagon, Josiah," Slater ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Load it with the cured pine we cut for the new barn." The thick cuts. Josiah's weathered face broke into a slow, knowing grin. "And where might we be taking this fine timber, Mr. Knox?" "To build a house," Slater grunted, spurring his horse forward. "Before I have to dig a grave." Amelia did not hear the wagon until it was nearly upon her. The rattling of heavy wooden wheels over the hardpan and the snorting of draft horses finally cut through the ringing in her ears. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Out here, visitors did not bring good tidings. They brought foreclosure notices, threats, or worse. She lunged for the pile of salvaged belongings under a tarp and retrieved her father's heavy Sharps rifle. It was entirely too big for her, and her exhausted arms trembled as she leveled the heavy barrel toward the approaching dust cloud. As the wagon broke through the heat shimmer, she recognized the riders. Slater Knox. The man owned half the county, a towering figure of wealth and quiet intimidation. He rode beside a heavy flatbed wagon driven by an older cowhand, drawn by two massive Clydesdales. "That's far enough, Mr. Knox." Amelia's voice cracked, dry and raspy from the dust, but she held the rifle steady. "I have nothing for you. You can turn that rig around." Slater raised a gloved hand, signaling Josiah to halt the wagon. He sat easily in the saddle, entirely unbothered by the heavy-caliber rifle pointed at his chest. He took his time looking over the collapsed pile of burnt wood she had been working on, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Put the gun down, Miss Thornton," Slater said. His voice carried effortlessly over the wind, calm, deep, and utterly devoid of fear. "If I meant you harm, I wouldn't have brought a wagon full of premium milled pine and a box of galvanized nails." Amelia blinked, her eyes darting from Slater to the wagon. It was piled high with beautiful, clean, golden wood. The smell of fresh sap cut through the acrid scent of ash that had lingered on her property for weeks. For a brief, agonizing second, she wanted to drop the gun and weep with gratitude. But pride and hard-learned paranoia stiffened her spine. "I didn't order any lumber," she said, her chin tilting upward. "And I certainly can't pay for it. So unless you're running a charity, Mr. Knox, take it back. I won't owe a debt I can't pay. Not to Elias Caldwell. And certainly not to you." Slater dismounted. He was taller than she realized, moving with a predatory grace that seemed at odds with his bulk. He walked slowly toward her, ignoring the rifle, until the tip of the barrel was mere inches from his chest. "Your father was a stubborn fool, Miss Thornton," Slater said bluntly, looking down into her fiercely defiant eyes. "Looks like it's genetic. Speak ill of my father again and I'll see if this trigger works." She shot back, though her arms were screaming in agony from the weight of the gun. Slater's eyes softened just a fraction. He reached out with two fingers and gently but firmly pushed the barrel of the Sharps toward the ground. "You're building a coffin out of kindling," he stated. "Winter is 6 weeks away. The first frost is maybe 2. You stay out here with this rot, you'll be dead." "That's not an insult. That's a fact. I am surviving," Amelia insisted, though a traitorous tear cut a clean line down her dust-caked cheek. She wiped it away furiously. "Barely," Slater countered. He stepped back and gestured to the wagon. "I have more lumber than I need. You have a plot of land that borders my southern grazing pasture. The fence line there is washed out and the creek bed needs clearing. We strike a bargain. I give you the lumber, the nails, and the labor to put up a weather-tight cabin. You give me a signed lease granting Cross M cattle access to the water on your southern edge for the next 5 years, and you clear that fence line once you're settled." Amelia stared at him, her mind racing. It was a business transaction. It wasn't charity. He was offering her dignity alongside survival. "Water rights?" she asked, suspiciously. "Caldwell has been trying to buy my water rights for months. Caldwell is a snake who wants to dry you out and sell the land to the railroad," Slater said flatly. "I just want my cattle to drink without wading through 3 miles of mud. Do we have a deal, Miss Thornton?" Amelia looked at the golden wood, then at the charred ruins of her life. She looked back into Slater's eyes. They were severe, yes, but there was an unexpected anchor of honesty in them. Slowly, she lowered the rifle completely. She extended her blistered, battered hand. "Deal, mister." "Knox." Slater took her hand. His grip was firm, engulfing her small hand in his leather-clad palm. He felt the rough, torn skin of her blisters, and a sharp pang of unfamiliar protective instinct flared in his chest. He let go quickly. "Josiah," Slater barked, turning back to the wagon. "Unload the timber. We start framing before dusk." The next 4 days were a blur of grueling, exhausting, yet immensely satisfying labor. Amelia had expected Slater to simply drop off the wood and leave his ranch hand to do the work. Instead, the wealthy cattle baron arrived before sunrise every morning, tools in hand, working shoulder to shoulder with her and Josiah until the stars blanketed the Wyoming sky. They spoke very little. There was no need. A quiet rhythm established itself between them. Slater would measure and cut the heavy timbers with precise, powerful strokes of a handsaw. Amelia would align the joints, and together they would drive the long nails home. For Amelia, watching Slater work was a revelation. Beneath his taciturn exterior was a man of intense focus and surprising gentleness. Whenever he saw her struggling with a heavy plank, he didn't coddle her or tell her to step aside. He simply shifted his grip to take the brunt of the weight, allowing her to finish the task. He treated her as a partner in the labor, an equal, which did more to heal her battered spirit than any words of comfort could have. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the skeleton of a sturdy, single-room cabin stood proudly against the horizon. The roof trusses were in place, and they were beginning to nail down the floorboards. The scent of pine was intoxicating. Amelia was kneeling on the floor, hammering a nail, when Slater walked over and set a tin canteen beside her. "Drink," he commanded softly, wiping his brow with a bandana. She sat back on her heels, taking the canteen. The water was cool and sweet. "Thank you," she breathed, looking up at the framed walls. It's beautiful." Slater, it was the first time she had used his Christian name. The air between them suddenly felt thick, the rhythmic sounds of Josiah working outside fading into the background. Slater looked down at her, at the way the sunlight caught the auburn strands of hair escaping her braid. He felt a dangerous, pulling sensation in his chest, a feeling he had kept buried since the war. Before he could respond, the sharp, frantic whinny of Josiah's horse shattered the quiet. "Boss," Josiah's voice rang out, laced with a tension that made Slater instantly drop his hammer and step out the framed doorway. Approaching from the east, kicking up a massive cloud of alkaline dust, were 5 riders. They were riding hard, fanning out in a semicircle as they approached the property line. Amelia stepped out behind Slater, her heart dropping into her stomach. Leading the pack, riding a flashy palomino, was Gideon Finch. Gideon was a massive, scarred brute of a man who served as Elias Caldwell's chief enforcer, debt collector, and, many suspected, arsonist. Slater didn't say a word. He walked calmly to his saddlebags, resting on a nearby stump, and pulled out a Winchester repeating rifle. He didn't raise it, merely holding it casually in his right hand, resting the barrel against his shoulder. He stepped in front of Amelia, effectively shielding her with his broad frame. The riders pulled up sharply, their horses dancing and snorting, 10 yards from the new cabin. Gideon spat onto the ground, his cold, dead eyes taking in the fresh timber, then lingering on Slater. "Well now," Gideon sneered, resting his hand on the butt of his revolver. "Ain't this a touching domestic scene? Didn't figure you for a carpenter, Knox, especially not for a squatter who's defaulting on her bank loans." "This is private property, Finch," Slater said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're trespassing." "Not for long, it ain't," Gideon replied, pulling a folded piece of heavy parchment from his vest pocket. "Mr. Caldwell sent us to deliver a final notice of eviction. Miss Thornton here owes the First Bank of Sweetwater $3,000, due immediately. Since she obviously ain't got it, the land defaults to the bank at sundown tomorrow." Amelia pushed past Slater, her anger overriding her fear. My father paid off that loan 2 months ago. Gideon, you and Caldwell know it. You destroyed the receipts when you burned my house down. Gideon feigned a look of shock. Burned your house? That's a serious accusation, little lady. Tragic accident, that fire. Shame your daddy didn't make it out. Now, unless you've got $3,000 hiding under these new floorboards, I suggest you pack up your little camp here and start walking. Gideon's men chuckled, their hands resting menacingly on their weapons. Slater racked the lever of the Winchester. The loud, metallic clack-clack cut through the laughter like a scythe. Every man on horseback froze. The lady said she paid. Slater stated, stepping forward. His eyes locked onto Gideon's, cold and hard as glacier ice. And I don't see any judge's signature on that paper, Finch, which means you're just 5 armed men threatening a woman on her own land. Out here, we hang men for less. Gideon's face flushed dark red. You're stepping into a bear trap, Knox. Mr. Caldwell ain't going to like you interfering with bank business. This land is vital to the county's interests. This land, Slater replied, his grip tightening on the rifle, belongs to Amelia Thornton, and as of yesterday, she and the Cross M Ranch are in a legally binding business partnership. You threaten her. You threaten my interests. You threaten my interests. I put you in the ground. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the wind whistling through the new pine rafters. Gideon weighed his odds, 5 against 2, but one of those 2 was Slater Knox, a man known to be lethally fast and completely merciless when crossed. Sundown tomorrow, Thornton, Gideon spat, yanking his horse's reins. We'll be back, and we'll have the sheriff with us. Let's see your rich boyfriend shoot a badge. Gideon wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, his men following closely behind. Amelia watched them go, her knees suddenly weak. She stumbled back against the doorframe, her breathing shallow. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her. Caldwell had the law in his pocket. A new cabin wouldn't save her if the sheriff dragged her away in chains. Slater uncocked the rifle and set it down. He turned to her, his expression grim. They're coming back, Amelia whispered, a tremor of despair in her voice. He'll bring the sheriff. They'll take it all, Slater. They killed my father for this dirt, and now they'll take it anyway. Slater walked over, taking her trembling shoulders in his heavy, calloused hands. His touch was firm, grounding her. They won't take anything, Slater said, his voice a fierce, low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. I know Caldwell's game. He wants the right-of-way for the railroad. But there's something else on this land. Something he killed your father for. And we have exactly 24 hours to figure out what it is. He looked over her shoulder toward the east, where the dust of the riders was settling. Josiah, Slater called out without looking away from Amelia. Ride back to the ranch. Tell the boys to saddle up and bring the rifles. The Cross M is moving its herd tonight. We're grazing them right here. Amelia stared at him, bewildered. You're bringing your men? Slater, you can't start a range war over me. Slater looked down into her eyes, the stoic mask finally slipping just enough to reveal the burning intensity beneath. It stopped being just about you the moment I rode down that ridge. Amelia, I don't abandon my partners. He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. And I protect what's mine. The sun dipped below the jagged teeth of the Wind River Range, bleeding crimson and bruised purple across the Wyoming sky. True to Slater Knox's word, the ground soon began to tremble. A low, thunderous rumble rolled across the plains, followed by the distinctive calls of hardened cowboys and the lowing of 300 head of Cross M cattle. Josiah had returned, bringing with him a dozen of Slater's most trusted hands. They were men carved from leather and grit, names like Deacon Miller, an old buffalo hunter, and a young, sharp-eyed vaquero named Mateo. They drove the herd directly onto Amelia's southern pasture, establishing an impenetrable wall of livestock, men, and campfires between the newly built pine cabin and the road to town. Inside the half-finished cabin, the air was thick with the scent of fresh sap and kerosene. Amelia lit a solitary lantern, its warm amber glow casting long, dancing shadows against the raw wooden walls. Slater stood near the doorway, watching the perimeter. The Winchester was never far from his reach. My father was a stubborn man, but he wasn't a fool, Amelia said softly, breaking the heavy silence. She was kneeling by a pile of salvaged belongings they had dragged inside. If he found something valuable enough for Elias Caldwell to kill him over, he wouldn't have just left it lying around. He would have hidden it. Slater turned, his massive frame silhouetted against the starry night. Where? The old house, Amelia replied, her eyes finding his in the dim light. The cellar didn't burn. It was dug straight into the limestone. When the roof collapsed, it buried the trapdoor in ash and charred beams. But the cellar itself should be intact. Slater didn't hesitate. Show me. They walked under the cover of darkness toward the black, skeletal remains of the Thornton homestead. The smell of cold ash still hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of Amelia's loss. Slater carried a heavy iron crowbar and a shovel, while Amelia held the lantern. It took them an hour of back-breaking labor to clear the debris covering the old kitchen floor. Amelia's hands, already raw from building the cabin, bled anew, but she refused to stop. Slater worked with a quiet, relentless power, tossing aside blackened oak beams as if they were kindling. Finally, his shovel struck iron. "Here," Slater grunted, dropping to one knee. He wedged the crowbar beneath the heavy iron ring of the cellar door and heaved. With a groan of protesting hinges, the door gave way, revealing a pitch-black square in the earth. Amelia lowered the lantern. The air rushing up was stale and smelled of damp earth, but the wooden steps remained intact. They descended into the cool, claustrophobic space. Shelves of shattered mason jars and ruined preserves lined the walls, but Amelia walked straight to the back corner. "My father trusted the earth more than he trusted banks," she whispered. She dropped to her knees and began to claw at the loose dirt beneath the bottom shelf. Slater knelt beside her, his large hands moving the soil in heavy scoops. A dull thud echoed in the small space. Slater pulled a heavy, fire-blackened strongbox from the dirt. He set it between them and smashed the rusted padlock with the heel of his crowbar. Amelia's breath hitched as she threw the lid back. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, a canvas pouch heavy with gold double eagles, and a stack of stiff, folded vellum papers. She unrolled the papers, holding them close to the lantern glass. They were geological survey maps, stamped with the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. Notes were scribbled furiously in the margins in her father's jagged handwriting. "Look at this," Amelia breathed, tracing a finger over a topographical map of their valley. "He had a man out here last spring, a surveyor named Professor Hayden, out of Cheyenne. He told me he was looking for artesian wells." Slater leaned in close. The proximity sent a sudden jolt through Amelia. She could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest, smell the scent of leather, pine, and honest sweat on his skin. "He wasn't looking for water," Slater said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He tapped a cluster of densely drawn circles on the map, right at the southern bend of Amelia's Creek. "Look at the chemical notations. Hydrocarbons, viscosity measurements." Slater looked up, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers. "It's oil, Amelia." "Black gold?" "A surface seep connected to a massive underground reservoir. It's the same kind of deposit they struck up in the Dallas Dome a few years back. This land isn't just worth a railroad right-of-way. It's worth millions." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. "Caldwell knew," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "Caldwell saw the surveyor. He figured it out. And when my father refused to sell, he burned him alive for it." Slater's jaw hardened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. The protective fury that had been simmering in his gut since he first saw her swinging that hammer erupted into a cold, calculated rage. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping away a streak of soot from her cheek. The gesture was shockingly tender for a man so fierce. "Caldwell made two mistakes," Slater said softly. "He left you alive, and he let you build a fortress on my border." Slater stood up, pulling her up with him. He kept her hand enclosed in his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Gather the papers and the gold. We have a war to prepare for." Dawn broke over the Sweetwater Valley in a wash of pale, cold light. The morning frost clung to the prairie grass, signaling the death of summer. Amelia stood on the small porch of her new pine cabin, the heavy Sharps rifle resting against the railing. She wore her father's old canvas duster over her dress to ward off the chill. To her left and right, the Cross M cowboys were dug in. Deacon Miller was perched on the limestone ridge with a buffalo rifle, scanning the horizon. Mateo and 3 others were positioned behind the thick wooden slats of the water trough. Slater stood beside her in the center of the yard. He had traded his work clothes for a long black riding coat. 2 Colt peacemakers hung low on his hips, and his Winchester rested easily in the crook of his arm. He looked like the devil's own right hand, and Amelia had never felt safer. At exactly 10 o'clock, the lookout on the ridge whistled sharp and low. "Company coming, Wass," Deacon shouted down. "Looks like 10. No, 12 riders. A buckboard wagon in the rear." Slater didn't flinch. "Hold your fire until I give the word," he commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. "Nobody shoots unless fired upon. We have the high ground and the law on our side, even if they wear the tin stars." A thick cloud of dust heralded their arrival. Elias Caldwell rode at the front. He was a small, meticulously groomed man in a bowler hat and a tailored suit that looked entirely out of place on the rugged frontier. Beside him rode Sheriff Hiram Cobb, a nervous man sweating profusely despite the cold, his silver star pinned to a greasy vest. Flanking them was Gideon Finch, grinning like a feral dog, and 9 hired guns holding repeating rifles. Caldwell signaled for the posse to halt 20 yards from the cabin. He took a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his brow, his eyes darting nervously over the heavily armed cowboys surrounding the property. This was not the helpless, weeping girl he had expected to find. "Knox," Caldwell called out, his voice thin and reedy. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you are obstructing the law. Miss Thornton is in default. The bank claims this land as of this morning." Slater stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the frosted earth. He walked slowly until he was 10 paces from Caldwell's horse. "Morning, Elias." "Sheriff Cobb," Slater said, nodding slightly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Thornton's debts are settled." "Lies," Gideon Finch barked, leveling his rifle at Slater. Immediately, the distinct clack-clack of a dozen lever-action rifles echoing from the ridge and the trough silenced him. Deacon's heavy buffalo rifle was trained dead center on Gideon's chest. Gideon slowly lowered his weapon, swallowing hard. "The debt was $3,000, Caldwell said, his face flushing with anger. "Are you telling me this squatter somehow produced the funds overnight?" Amelia stepped off the porch, flanked by Slater. She reached into her father's canvas pouch and pulled out 3 heavy stacks of gold double eagles. She tossed them into the dirt at the feet of Sheriff Cobb's horse. The heavy gold coins spilled out, gleaming in the morning sun. $3,000, Amelia said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "Count it, Sheriff. The Thornton debt is paid in full. Now get off my land." Caldwell stared at the gold, his eye twitching. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his polite veneer cracking. "That's stolen. She stole it." "It was in my father's strongbox," Amelia shot back. "The one that survived the fire you set, Caldwell." "That's slander," Caldwell shrieked, turning to the sheriff. "Arrest her, Cobb. I want her off this property. The bank has already sold the deed to the Union Pacific." Sheriff Cobb looked at the gold, then at the 12 heavily armed cowboys pointing guns at him, and finally, at Slater Knox's icy stare. "Well now, Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff stammered, wiping his neck. "If the lady pays the debt, the law says the land is hers. I can't evict a landowner who ain't in default." "You spineless coward," Caldwell spat. He pointed a trembling finger at Amelia. "You think you've won? You don't know what you're sitting on. I'll tie you up in territorial court for the next 10 years. I'll bleed you dry." "Actually," Slater interrupted, reaching inside his long coat, He pulled out the geological survey maps and held them up. "I think she knows exactly what she's sitting on, Elias. And as of midnight last night, the Cross M Ranch signed a partnership agreement to lease the mineral and drilling rights to this property. My lawyers in Cheyenne are filing the paperwork with the governor's office as we speak." Caldwell's face went completely white. "The oil. Knox knew about the oil." "You," Caldwell stammered, realizing he had lost not just the land, but millions of dollars. The fury overtook his reason. "Gideon, kill them both." Gideon Finch went for his revolver, but Slater was faster. It was a blur of motion, a testament to the violent years he had spent taming this savage country. Before Gideon could even clear leather, Slater drew his peacemaker and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet shattered Gideon's shoulder. The enforcer screamed, dropping his gun and falling backward off his horse into the dirt. Chaos erupted. The hired guns raised their weapons, but Slater roared, "Hold!" He cocked the hammer of his Colt, aiming it squarely between Elias Caldwell's eyes. "Tell your dogs to stand down, Elias, or the next bullet clears your head of all those grand ideas." Caldwell froze, staring down the black barrel of Slater's gun. The absolute certainty of death in Knox's eyes broke him. He raised shaking hands. "Stand down," Caldwell screamed to his men. "Don't shoot." The hired guns, seeing their leader broken and knowing they were outgunned by the Cross M crew, slowly lowered their rifles. "Sheriff Cobb," Slater said, not moving his gun from Caldwell, "I believe you have an attempted murder to investigate regarding Thomas Thornton, and I'm willing to bet a wounded bird like Gideon Finch will sing a very pretty song about who gave the order to light the match, assuming he gets medical attention." Sheriff Cobb swallowed hard, nodding vigorously. "Yes, sir, Mr. Knox. We'll take them into custody right now." "Get off my property," Amelia commanded, her voice cold as the winter wind. "And if you ever look toward this valley again, I'll use the sharps." The posse scrambled. Gideon was hauled up over his saddle, groaning in agony. Caldwell yanked his horse around, not daring to look back, and spurred the animal into a gallop. Within minutes, the dust cloud was retreating back toward Sweetwater, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Amelia watched them go until they were out of sight. The adrenaline that had kept her standing suddenly vanished, and her knees buckled. Slater was there instantly. He holstered his gun and caught her by the waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. She buried her face in his coat, breathing in the scent of him, letting the tears she had held back for weeks finally fall. He wrapped his strong arms around her, burying his face in her auburn hair. "It's over," he murmured, his voice fiercely protective. "You're safe. You built your shelter, Amelia, and I'm going to make damn sure it stands forever." The victory over Elias Caldwell at the cabin had been decisive, a line drawn in the Wyoming dirt that even the corrupt banker hadn't dared to cross. But out on the frontier, victory was rarely a final destination. It was often just a brief, gasping pause before the land hurled its next hardship at you. News of the oil strike spread with the speed of a prairie fire. Down in Cheyenne, Slater's attorneys moved swiftly, navigating the labyrinth of territorial law to officially register the Thornton Knox claim with the office of Territorial Governor William Hale. The thick stacks of stamped parchment solidified their partnership, legally shielding the land and its subterranean wealth from the predatory grasp of both Caldwell and the Union Pacific Railroad's aggressive expansion agents. But as late November swept across the Sweetwater Valley, it brought with it an enemy that could not be fought with injunctions, gold, or repeating rifles. The sky, which had been a brilliant, forgiving blue for weeks, turned the heavy color of bruised iron. The wind shifted, howling down from the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, carrying the bitter promise of a winter of unprecedented ferocity. It didn't just snow, it assaulted the earth, burying the landscape under feet of drifting, blinding white. The temperature plummeted, freezing the creek solid and turning the prairie into a treacherous, frozen ocean. Amelia's pine cabin, heavily reinforced, chinked, and insulated by the seasoned Cross M ranch hands, stood as a warm, defiant beacon in the center of the white void. Inside, the heavy black iron stove radiated a steady, comforting heat. filling the small space with the scent of burning hickory, fresh pine, and roasted coffee beans. Slater had taken to spending more and more of his evenings there. Ostensibly, his presence was strictly business. He brought over the complex surveyor maps and geological reports to plan the heavy equipment needed for the spring drilling operations. But the unspoken truth hung heavy and warm in the air between them. The vast, sprawling mansion at the Cross M Ranch felt impossibly empty to him now. He simply could not bring himself to leave her side, finding more genuine peace in this single-room cabin than he had known in a lifetime of building his empire. One evening, as the wind screamed like a wounded animal against the thick timber walls, Amelia sat in a rocking chair near the fire. She was meticulously mending a jagged tear in one of Slater's heavy canvas work coats, the rhythmic pull of the needle and thread a soothing counterpoint to the storm. Slater sat across from her at the sturdy oak table they had built together, his large, scarred hands dwarfing a tin cup of black coffee. He wasn't looking at the maps spread out before him. He was looking at her. The harshness and exhaustion that had marked her features during the brutal summer months had softened, replaced by a quiet, radiant strength. "The snow is drifting up past the windows on the north side," Slater noted, his deep, gravelly voice a comforting anchor against the raging blizzard outside. "Josiah and the boys moved the last of the herd into the canyon shelters this afternoon. We're snowed in, Amelia. At least for the next few days." Amelia paused her sewing. She looked up, the warm amber light of the kerosene lantern catching the auburn highlights in her hair. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips, a look reserved entirely for the fierce, quiet man sitting across from her. "Then I suppose I'll have to put up with you a little longer, Mr. Knox." Slater set his coffee down slowly. His steel-gray eyes, usually so guarded and unreadable, grew dark and intense as they met and held hers. "I haven't heard you complain yet." The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, charged with a sudden electricity that had nothing to do with the winter storm. But before Amelia could formulate a reply, a sound cut through the relentless howl of the blizzard, a sound that fundamentally did not belong to the wind or the settling wood of the cabin. It was a sharp, unnatural crack, like heavy ice splitting under immense pressure, followed immediately by the frantic, terrified whinnying of Slater's massive black gelding in the attached lean-to. Slater was on his feet in a fraction of a second. The relaxed, intimate demeanor vanished completely, replaced by the lethal, cold focus of a seasoned predator. He reached for his gun belt resting on the back of the chair, strapping the heavy Colt peacemakers to his hips with practiced, fluid motions, before snatching his Winchester rifle from the corner of the room. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, his voice low, tight, and completely devoid of its previous warmth. He checked the chamber of the rifle, his eyes already scanning the heavy wooden door. "Keep the sharps loaded." Amelia dropped the coat, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She rushed to the corner and picked up her father's heavy rifle, her hands trembling slightly despite the heat of the room. "Slater, what is it?" she asked, her voice tight with rising panic. "It's a whiteout out there. Nobody could ride in this." Slater paused at the back door leading to the lean-to, his hand resting on the cold iron latch. He looked back at her, his jaw set in a grim, unforgiving line. A desperate man could. He slipped out the door, pulling it shut silently behind him to keep the draft out. The cold inside the uninsulated lean-to hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and biting instantly into his skin. He moved quickly to the gelding, running a calming, heavy hand over the beast's trembling neck to silence it. He peered through the gaps in the exterior wooden siding, scanning the swirling, chaotic white darkness toward the southern creek bed, the exact site of the porous limestone and the oil seep. For a long moment, there was nothing but the blinding, horizontal snow. Then, barely visible through the raging squall, he saw it, a faint, unnatural orange glow, flickering weakly against the gale. Caldwell. The realization hit Slater with cold clarity. The banker had lost in the courts, his legal avenues completely shut down by the governor's office. So, he had turned to the shadows. If Elias Caldwell couldn't have the oil, he was going to make damn sure no one else could ever pull it from the earth. Slater shoved the exterior door open and plunged into the waist-deep snow. The wind roared in his ears, blinding him, but he used the heavy wooden posts of the fence line they had built to guide him blindly toward the creek. Every step was a brutal battle against the elements, the snow dragging at his boots like wet cement. As he finally drew closer to the frozen creek bank, the orange glow resolved into a terrifyingly clear image. Resting directly over the fragile crust of the oil seep was a heavy wooden crate. Attached to it was a sputtering, waterproof fuse, hissing violently as it burned downward. Dynamite. It was enough explosive power to completely collapse the subterranean structure, burying the reservoir under millions of tons of worthless rock. Or worse, to ignite a surface fire that would burn uncontrollably for a decade. Standing over the crate was a bulky figure wrapped head to toe in heavy furs. The man was striking another match, shielding it with his body to ensure the damp, wind-whipped fuse took a permanent hold. It wasn't Caldwell. The banker was far too much of a coward to freeze in the dark doing his own dirty work. This was a hired saboteur, paid well enough to risk freezing to death. "Step away from it!" Slater roared, his voice tearing through the wind as he violently racked the lever of his Winchester. The metallic clack-clack was barely audible over the storm, but the intent was clear. The saboteur spun around, dropping the match into the snow. Without a second of hesitation, the man yanked a heavy revolver from the folds of his fur coat and fired blindly into the whiteout. The muzzle flash strobed brightly. Slater felt a sharp, burning tear across his left bicep as the bullet grazed him, ripping through his heavy canvas coat and biting a shallow trench into his flesh. He didn't flinch. He didn't break stride. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, sighted through the swirling snow, and fired a single, deafening shot. The heavy rifle bucked against his shoulder. The saboteur jerked violently backward, clutching his chest, the revolver slipping from his lifeless fingers as he collapsed backward into a heavy snowbank. Slater ignored the stinging, hot pain radiating down his arm. He dropped the rifle into the snow and lunged desperately for the wooden crate. The fuse was hissing furiously, the bright spark eating away the cord, inches away from the blasting caps. He didn't have time to pull a knife. He grabbed the burning, sparking cord with his bare, calloused hand, ignoring the searing heat, and yanked it brutally from the dynamite casing. He plunged the sparking end deep into the frozen snowpack until it died with a final, wet hiss. For a long moment, Slater remained on his knees in the freezing snow, his chest heaving, his burned hand clutching the dead fuse. Slowly, the absolute silence of the wilderness returned, save for the endless, shrieking wind. Caldwell had played his final, most desperate card in the dark, and once again, he had lost. The brutal Wyoming winter eventually broke, its icy grip surrendering to the relentless march of spring. The massive snowdrifts that had buried the Sweetwater Valley retreated back toward the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, leaving the prairie soil rich, dark, and pregnant with life. When the heavy snow finally melted near the southern creek bed, it revealed the frozen, damning evidence of Elias Caldwell's desperation, the lifeless body of his hired saboteur and the unexploded crates of dynamite resting directly over the oil seep. Word reached Cheyenne fast, and federal marshals descended on the town of Sweetwater with a swift, unforgiving justice. Attempting to obliterate a federally registered resource claim, crossed a line that local corruption could no longer protect. Amelia rode into town with Slater to watch the arrest. Caldwell, once the untouchable kingmaker of the valley, was dragged from his pristine bank in heavy iron shackles. His signature bowler hat was knocked into the spring mud, trampled beneath the boots of the marshals. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken as they loaded him into a reinforced prison wagon bound for Denver. Watching the wagon disappear over the horizon, Amelia felt a heavy, dark stone lift from her chest. Her father's murder had finally been answered. Back on the southern edge of her land, the air was now filled with a new, triumphant kind of thunder. The rhythmic, earth-shaking pounding of a massive steam-powered drill echoed across the plains, driving deep into the limestone beneath the creek. A towering wooden derrick, constructed from the finest thick-cut timber the Cross M mill could produce, now pierced the bright Wyoming sky. It was a staggering monument to their hard-won victory. Amelia stood on the wide front porch of the pine cabin, the morning sun warming her face. The bitter scent of cold ash that had haunted this plot of land for nearly a year was entirely gone, replaced by the sweet, intoxicating fragrance of blooming sagebrush and damp pine. She wore a new dress of deep blue cotton, the fabric soft against her skin, her auburn hair unbound and blowing freely in the gentle southern breeze. She rested her hands on the porch railing, looking out over the sprawling green valley. The land was undeniably hers now. The future stretched out before her, secure and limitless. But as she listened to the steady thump-thump of the drill, she knew that the oil, the wealth, and the deed meant nothing without the man who had helped her secure it. Down by the derrick, Slater Knox handed a heavy wrench to one of the engineers and began walking up the well-worn dirt path toward the cabin. He was wiping thick black grease from his calloused hands with a red shop rag. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepened by months of relentless labor and the stress of the winter siege. But his broad shoulders were completely relaxed. For the first time since she had met him, the lethal, coiled spring tension that always seemed to hum beneath his skin was entirely gone. There was a profound, quiet peace in his steel-gray eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his gaze lifting from the muddy path to lock onto her standing on the porch. They hit the main pressure pocket. "Amelia," Slater said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying effortlessly over the mechanical roar of the distant drill. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, tossing the grease-stained rag over his shoulder. The engineers took the pressure readings. "They say it's bigger than the Dallas Dome. The first barrel should be flowing by tomorrow morning." Amelia smiled, a radiant, unguarded expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She gathered her skirts and stepped down off the wooden porch to meet him in the sunlit yard. "We did it, Slater. You did it," he corrected gently, his voice dropping to a softer, far more intimate register. "You stood your ground when anyone else would have run or died. You built a shelter out of broken boards. I had a little help," she whispered, taking a slow step closer. She reached out, her clean, unblistered hands gently resting against the heavy, familiar canvas of his work coat. Slater looked down at her. The memory of her swinging that heavy iron hammer in the swirling red dust, fiercely fighting for her survival, was burned forever into his mind. He reached out, his large, rough hands cupping her face with a tenderness that still surprised her. His thumbs lightly, reverently, traced the high curve of her cheekbones. "I came down from that ridge to save a stubborn woman from freezing," Slater murmured, his eyes searching hers, entirely stripped of his stoic armor. "I didn't expect her to save me right back." "Are you saved, Mr. Knox?" Amelia asked, her breath catching as the remaining distance between them vanished. "I am now," he answered. He kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate, fleeting passion of two people clinging to survival in a harsh, unforgiving land, but the deep, anchoring certainty of a man who had finally found his home. The kiss was a vow, sealed under the vast, open Wyoming sky. They had fought the bitter earth, the deadly winter, and the boundless greed of men, and they had won. Together, they would build a sprawling empire across the Sweetwater Valley, but this simple pine cabin, born from the ashes of her tragic past and the unyielding strength of his hands, would always remain the true heart of it. The story of Amelia Thornton and Slater Knox became a legend whispered across the Wyoming plains, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the frontier. From the ashes of a burned homestead and a desperate stand with a rusted hammer, an empire of cattle and oil was born. Their partnership, forged in the fires of adversity and solidified by an unshakable love, proved that survival in the Wild West wasn't just about drawing a gun. It was about the courage to rebuild when all seemed lost. They ruled the Sweetwater Valley for decades, their legacy living on in the thriving towns and towering derricks that dotted the landscape. But to those who truly knew them, their greatest achievement was never the wealth they amassed, but the unbreakable shelter they found in one another.